I've been asked to talk about the differences between ancients and moderns. The 18th century has seen the appearance of what we nowadays would consider to be the earliest recognisable Grand Lodge. This was in 1717. But within 50 years there had occurred a major split, which had widespread repercussions at the time upon the structure, the ritual, and the organisation of English Freemasonry, indeed also on Masonry worldwide. Broadly speaking, English Freemasonry came during this period to be divided between two very different groups, each claiming to be the only true upholders of Masonic tradition and belief. This division was between two Grand Lodges, the original Grand Lodge and a body calling itself the Grand Lodge of England according to the old institutions. It was a rivalry that went deep within England, but went even deeper in the American colonies, and it represented a split which was at one time to affect the ritual within the lodges, organisation inside the lodges, and indeed the whole structure of the degrees as worked in the lodges under each of these different organisations. When four London lodges came together in 1717 to form one overall body, a Grand Lodge, there developed a great deal of public interest in Freemasonry. Some of this interest was reflected by the creation of new lodges by this Grand Lodge, and some by the decision of a number of existing lodges, both in London and the provinces, to declare their allegiance to it. The extent of this public interest was also shown by the appearance of a number of so-called exposures, which purported to give details of the rituals and the secrets of Freemasonry. One of these, entitled Masonry Dissected, was by a writer called Samuel Pritchard, and it proved so popular that 3 reprints appeared during the first 11 days after the initial publication. Part of this interest in Freemasonry was derived from a general curiosity about the nature of Freemasonry, but some of it also seems to come from a desire to secure access to the secrets and, above all, the charities of Freemasonry, without actually becoming a Freemason. There would seem to have been a number of impostors or irregular Masons securing entrance to lodge meetings through knowledge gained from such publication. Grand Lodge attempted to restrict such irregular access by laying down a rule that no person whatsoever should be admitted into lodges unless some member of the lodge then present would vouch for them being regular Masons. This, however, did not work, and in 1739 Grand Lodge decided to deal with these impostors by varying the recognition words connected with the first and second degrees. The impostors would not be aware of these changes and so would be excluded. However, it is not clear whether all lodges and regular Masons were actually informed of these changes. But this introduction was certainly one of the causes of what became the Great Schism within English Masons. It should perhaps be noted that the Grand Lodge set up in 1717 was not the only Grand Lodge in Great Britain. There was the Grand Lodge of Ireland, set up in 1725. The Grand Lodge of Scotland, set up in 1736. And also some lodges, English lodges, outside London, which continue to have an independent existence. One of these lodges, in 1725, set up what was called the Grand Lodge of All England, held at York, which always had but a shadowy existence as a Grand Lodge, and ceased operating in about 1792. Another such body, the Grand Lodge of England south of the River Trent, seems to have collapsed in 1789. None of these seemed, however, to be in serious rivalry with the Grand Lodge formed in London, and although there had been a growth in the number of lodges attaching themselves to Grand Lodge in London, there was no real problem about them. The much more serious rivalry occurred in 1751, when 6 lodges in London came together to form what they termed the most ancient and honourable society of free and accepted Masons. It used to be argued that these lodges were made up of persons who had broken away from the original Grand Lodge. But investigation has shown that none of their founding members had previously belonged to any lodge owing allegiance to the earlier Grand Lodge. Instead, it was seen that here was a group of members of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, resident in London, who found themselves unwelcome in English lodges, either because of their lowly social status or because they couldn't afford the financial obligations. Certainly, some were immigrants who had brought their masonry with them from Ireland, and there had been already in England a number of lodges of Freemasons owning allegiance to the Grand Lodge of Ireland before this. They did not work on the English pattern, nor did they work English rituals. Not all had succeeded in bettering themselves economically, because the first book of constitutions issued by this new body described the founders as men of some education and an honest character, but in low circumstances. They decided to form their own Grand Lodge. And this new group was not welcomed by the original Grand Lodge, which in 1755 received a complaint against certain brethren for forming and assembling under the domination of a lodge of ancient Masons, who as such considered themselves as independent of the society. They likewise tended to introduce into the draft the novelties and conceits of opinionative persons, and to create a belief there have been other societies of Masons more ancient than that of this ancient and honourable society. For its part, the new Grand Lodge denounced the Premier Grand Lodge, averring that it had adopted new plans and departed from the old landmarks. This new body claimed to have reverted to the old forms, setting themselves up as ancient Masons, and bestowing upon their rivals the name of moderns. Later, the ancients were to be further distinguished from their rivals by the names of the Grand Masters. The third Duke of Atholl became Grand Master of the Ancients in 1771, and after his death in 1774, his nephew, John Murray, succeeded both in temporal title and Masonic rank. He, the fourth Duke, created something of a record in Masonic advancement in 1773, when he was initiated, passed and raised, installed Master of the Grand Lodge, and elected Grand Master, all in 4 days. 24 days later, he was installed as Grand Master and remained in that office until 1781. Successive Dukes of Atholl were to be Grand Masters of the Ancients from 1771 to 1781 and from 1791 to 1813, so that thereafter lodges under the ancient constitution became known as Atholl lodges. From almost their very beginnings, each of these Grand Lodges expanded. For the original or modern Grand Lodge, this was a twofold expansion. In some instances, it was clearly the result of existing lodges decided to establish links with a larger body, such as, for example, in Cheshire and North Wales. But in many other cases, it was the result of individuals petitioning Grand Lodge to allow the establishment, the warranting, of new lodges either in London or in the provinces. By 1725, the list of lodges associated with the Premier Grand Lodge includes a number outside London and several indeed outside the British Isles. And although not all of these lodges had a long life, by the early 19th century there were over 1,000 separate lodges owing allegiance to the moderns. The ancients were also extremely active in the creation of new lodges. These lodges did not always survive, and their history is sometimes very complicated. The ancients very often reissued warrants of defunct lodges to newly established lodges, so it is not always possible to be certain of the actual numbers of ancient lodges in existence at any one time. But by the early 19th century, there were over 500 ancient lodges. They were particularly active in creating lodges outside London, and seem to have attracted support from the newly emerging centres of population in the north of England. Undoubtedly, the great figure amongst these ancients was Lawrence Dermot, to whose keen pen and indefatigable industry as its secretary for more than 30 years was due in large measure its success. Without him and his energy, the ancients might well have followed the same path as the other two Grand Lodges which had a shadowy existence during the century. In 1756, Dermot published the first book of laws for the ancients, entitled Achiman Raison, or Help to a Brother, much of which was taken from the Irish constitutions of 1751 and from the Book of Constitutions written by Anderson for the benefit of the moderns. A further feature of Freemasonry at this time was the appearance of military warrants. The giving of warrants not to a particular place, but, for example, to a particular military unit, and attached to specific regiments in the army. By the early 19th century, there were over 500 such lodges. Some of them derived their warrants from the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland. But the ancients were much more active in creating such military lodges than the moderns. And while over a quarter of these lodges had been given their warrants by the ancients, only some 10% were granted by the moderns. Relations between these bodies were strained. In 1759, for example, one Irish Mason in London petitioned the moderns for charity, only to be told by the Grand Secretary of that body, "You being an ancient Mason, you are not entitled to any of our charity. The ancient Masons have a lodge at the Five Bells in the Strand. Our society is neither arch, royal arch, or ancient, so you have no right to partake of our charity." And in 1777, the modern Grand Lodge made it clear that the persons calling themselves ancient Masons are not to be countenanced or acknowledged as Masons by any regular lodge or Mason under the Constitution of England, nor shall any regular Mason be present at any of their conventions. Neither shall any person initiated at these irregular meetings be admitted into any lodge without being remade and paying the usual making fee. The moderns attempted several times to squash the ancients, the most important being the move to obtain a charter to incorporate the society and to build a hall to accommodate Grand Lodge. The intended incorporation failed to get adequate support, and the ancients declared had they obtained the charter, it would have shut out all Masons of other neighbouring kingdoms. Interestingly enough, one of the differences to the Grand Lodges was in their attitude to provincial organisation. Over the years, the moderns created a large number of provinces, each of which were headed by provincial Grand Masters. But this was often merely a nominal title, since many of them, however, had no lodges within the provinces under their nominal direction, and clearly the moderns used that title to give individuals a higher status within Grand Lodge. The ancients were never really organised on a provincial basis, in that they seem to have created only one provincial Grand Lodge in England, and that had no English provincial Grand Master. On the other hand, the ancients did warrant 11 provincial Grand Lodges outside England, mainly in North America. The differences between the two forms of Masonry in England covered a great deal of ground. There were differences in the actual form of the lodges, and in the number and situation of officers of the lodge. There is, however, little evidence of the details of the ritual in the two Grand Lodges, and all that can be done is to list the charges made by the ancients against the moderns. It must, however, be emphasized that given the obvious problems of physical communication over the country, and the lack of any real check upon what was actually done in each lodge, there must have been in practice a considerable degree of variation between lodges, and almost certainly some practices of ancients came into use in the modern lodges and vice versa. Outside London, the differences were not always clear. Lodges under one Grand Lodge not infrequently received visits from other lodges under the other Grand Lodge. Evidence in some localities indicate a considerable movement of individuals between the two allegiances. Personal differences within the lodge could and did lead to a transfer of loyalties. Officers would move en bloc to the other Grand Lodge, sometimes taking their warrants with them. Some lodges indeed held dual warrants, owing allegiance to both at the same time. And in 1774, the ancients tried to warn those lodges suspected of holding dual warrants that unless they surrendered their modern warrants, the ancient warrants would be cancelled. They also tried to induce modern lodges to transfer their allegiance by offering them new warrants at a reduced fee. There were a number of principal charges made by the ancients against the moderns. The moderns didn't prepare their candidates properly, or indeed did not prepare them at all. The moderns abbreviated the sermons. They omitted the lectures, the formal catechisms by which the candidates received instruction in each degree. As already mentioned, the moderns had transposed the words of recognition between the first and second degrees, as well as using an incorrect word for a master mason. Other important differences between these two Grand Lodges lay in their internal organisation. The moderns had no appointments of deacons within the lodge, whereas for the ancients these officers played an important part in the ritual. Again, for the moderns, there was no ritual associated with the appointment and installation of a master of a lodge, whereas this was one of the key pieces of ritual as far as the ancients were concerned. Perhaps the most important difference between the two Grand Lodges was the way in which they regarded Freemasonry and with the way in which they dealt with the range of their degrees. Most of the ancient lodges worked degrees and rituals which we would now consider to be beyond the craft. They might have regarded themselves as the true guardians of Masonic tradition, yet they introduced more innovations than the moderns did. The moderns held out for the right to award degrees all the way through from the 3½ degrees up to that of Knight Templar. The records of many ancient lodges show them to be very active in conferring these degrees. Above all, there was the very different attitude held by the two towards the Royal Arch degree. Although there are some scattered references to the early version of this degree, and to its being worked in some craft lodges before 1750, the moderns did not look kindly upon it, describing themselves, as already shown, as being neither arch, Royal Arch, or ancient. And indeed, one Grand Secretary declared, "The Royal Arch is a society we do not acknowledge, and which we hold to be an invention to introduce innovation and seduce the brethren." The ancients, on the other hand, consider the Royal Arch degree to be an essential part of Freemasonry as the 4th degree, a degree certainly more august, sublime, and important than those which precede it, and is the summit and perfection of ancient Masonry. So far, the account of these Grand Lodges and their differences has dealt with affairs in England, and certainly there are no parallel set of divisions in either Ireland or Scotland. But elsewhere the divisions showed themselves most ferociously, and this was particularly true in the American colonies. Freemasonry had spread rapidly to the American colonies, and London had recognized a number of provincial Grand Masters there. But the news of the split in England did not take long to reach America, and within 6 years of the creation of the ancient Grand Lodge, there were already ancient lodges in the colonies, and in 1759 the ancients granted a warrant for the creation of a provincial Grand Lodge in Philadelphia. In each of the colonies, some lodges had received warrants from one Grand Lodge, and some lodges from the other. Rivalry was developed between the various lodges, and such was not healthy for the craft. An illustration of how deep the division between the two factions developed can be found with the story of Benjamin Franklin. He was originally a member of a Moderns Lodge in Philadelphia. He went on a mission to France, but on his return it transpired his lodge had changed to and received a new warrant from the ancients. In consequence, it no longer recognised him, and even declined to give him Masonic honours at his funeral. The history of the various lodges and Grand Lodges in South Carolina gives another illustration of this bitterness. A member of one lodge writes, "We have been informed they have gone so far on the admission of a person into the lodges as to tender an oath to promise and declare he will never visit a modern lodge or suffer modern to visit their lodge." Some of these splits demonstrated differences in social background, but were clearly accentuated by deep political divisions too. In many cases, those lodges which adhered to the modern Strand Lodge adhered to the Loyalist, i.e. British cause, and were thus tarred with the Tory label. Most of the ancients seem to have been revolutionary in their politics. At the end of the 18th century, there remained differences between the Grand Lodges. In many cases, a result of a clash of personalities more than anything else. But they could be brought together by real threats to their existence. Reactions in England to the French Revolution included a widespread fear of underground revolutionary movements. One of the most important of such movements in Britain was the United Irishmen, a united society of the Irish nation to make all Irishmen citizens, all citizens Irishmen. Its initial aims were Catholic emancipation and radical parliamentary reform, but it had become an avowedly Republican movement. And in 1799, a House of Commons secret committee reported that from the documents shown to it by the government, it had found the clearest proofs of a systematic design, long since adopted and acted upon by France in conjunction with domestic traitors, to overturn the laws, constitution and government, and every existing establishment, civil and ecclesiastical, both in Great Britain and Ireland, as well as to dissolve the connection between the two kingdoms. The secret committee went on to state that the most effectual engine employed for this purpose has been the institution of political societies, of a nature and description before unknown in any country, and inconsistent with public tranquillity and with the existence of public government. The government decided to introduce legislation to deal not only with the specific societies in that report, but all other secret societies. Their characteristic forms were denounced. These marks are wicked and illegal engagements of mutual fidelity and secrecy, by which the members are bound, the secrecy of electing the members, the secret government and conduct of the affairs of the society, secret appointments unknown to the bulk of the members, presidents and committees, which, veiling themselves from the general mass and knowledge of the members, plot and conduct the treason. All such societies which administer such oaths shall be declared unlawful confederacies, and the government introduced the Secret Societies Act. One major difficulty which then emerged was the position of Freemasons. The provisions of the bill against the use of secret oaths in societies potentially placed Freemasons in a difficult position, though arguably these oaths were outside the scope of the bill since they are not seditious. Most problematic was the requirement that initiations should take place in a public meeting. The two English Grand Lodges and the Scottish Grand Lodge had quickly to take action to try and deal with these problems before the bill got further. A delegation went to see the Prime Minister. The Masonic representatives included Lord Moira, acting Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, the Duke of Atholl, Grand Master of the Ancients and past Grand Master of Scotland, as well as other Grand Officers. At the meeting, the Prime Minister expressed his good opinion of society and said he was willing to recommend any laws to prevent the new act from affecting the society, provided that the society to be prevented from being made use of as a cover by evilly disposed persons for seditious purposes. Pitt himself reported in the House of Commons the Freemasons were very ready to acquiesce in any security the legislature would require from them for the tranquillity of the state. It was the Grand Lodge of the Ancients which took these concerns most seriously, perhaps because of their greater strength in the northwestern industrial towns where the alleged revolutionary roots were strongest, and because of their closer connections with Irish Masonry. The Grand Officers of the Ancients met at the Crown Anchor Tavern in the Strand and agreed to recommend two emergency measures. The first, to inhibit and totally prevent all public Masonic processions, and all private meetings of Masons or lodges of emergency upon any pretence whatever, and to suppress and suspend all Masonic meetings except upon the regular stated lodge meetings and Royal Arch chapters, which should be held open to all Masons to visit. The actions of the Ancients, and other assurances given to Pitt, convinced him that the Grand Lodges were determined to ensure that Freemasonry could not be used as a front for radical activity. And Pitt proposed what was essentially a system of self-regulation. Nothing in this act contained shall extend or be construed to extend to prevent the meetings of the Lodge or Society of Persons, which is now held at Freemasons' Hall in Great Queen Street, the County of Middlesex, and usually denominated the Grand Lodge of Freemasons of England, or the Lodge or Society of Persons, usually denominated the Grand Lodge of Masons of England according to the old institution, or of the Lodge or Society of Persons, which is now held at Edinburgh, and usually denominated the Grand Lodge of Freemasons of Scotland, or the meetings of any subordinate Lodge or Society of Persons, usually calling themselves Freemasons, the holding whereof shall be sanctioned or approved by any one of the above-mentioned lodges or societies. One odd side effect of the hasty way in which the amendments have been passed was that only lodges which existed before the 12th of July 1799 were protected by the legislation. This meant that the Grand Lodges could not authorise new lodges and had to resort to the expedient of giving lodges the warrant and number of extinct lodges. Having got so far and taken common action, there began to build up a momentum towards some sort of union between the Grand Lodges. Both sides had early expressed their own self-confidence. In 1786, the Grand Lodge Secretary of the Ancients declared they were in a flourishing state, daily increasing wealth and numbers. There remained problems over personalities, such as over one Thomas Harper, who held office in both Grand Lodges. He had been expelled from the Premier Lodge in 1803 because he was a senior member of the Ancients Lodge, although it took the Premier Grand Lodge more than a decade to recognise this, despite the fact he had been Grand Steward in 1796 for the Moderns at the time when he was Deputy Grand Secretary of the Ancients. An early step towards close relations came with the Masonic career of the Duke of Kent, one of the sons of George III. He had been made a past Grand Master of the Moderns in 1790, but in 1792, on being sent to Canada on military duty, he was appointed Grand Master of Masons for Lower Canada under the Ancients. He left Canada in 1794 and was presented with an address expressing the confident hope that under the conciliating influence of your Royal Highness, the fraternity in general of Freemasons in His Majesty's dominions will soon be united. Other forces came to effect. While Masonry inside London seems to be in a sort of decline, the numbers of lodges in the province were increasing, and clearly the rivalry between the Grand Lodges was less strong in the provinces. And the Grand Lodge of Scotland expressed the hope there might be a conciliation between the two societies in England. The first step towards negotiating an equitable union with the Ancients was a decision by the Premier Grand Lodge that this Grand Lodge to agree in opinion with the Committee of Charity it is not necessary any longer to continue in force those measures which were resorted to in or about the year 1739 respecting irregular Masons, and do therefore enjoin the several lodges to revert to the ancient landmarks of the society. In October 1809, they set up a special lodge of promulgation, whose brief was to ascertain that the ceremonies were in accord with those practised in Ireland, Scotland, and lodges over the seas, and establish the landmarks of the order. That was the public reason. The reality was they wished to bring themselves more into line with the practices of the ancients to ease the road to union. It took time, But in 1811, the acting Grand Master, the Earl of Moira, informed Grand Lodge that he and the Duke of Athol were fully of opinion there would be an event truly desirable and highly creditable to the name of Masons to consolidate under one head the two societies that existed in England. The result was a resolution that a Masonic union of the Grand Lodges, under the present Grand Masters, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and His Grace the Duke of Athol, on principles equal and honourable to both lodges, and preserving inviolate the landmarks of the ancient craft, would be, in the opinion of this Grand Lodge, expedient and advantageous to both. The resolution was passed unanimously, and a committee appointed for negotiating this most desirable arrangement. The Premier Grand Lodge was quite happy for the negotiators to have full powers to discuss and move forward without having to come back to the Grand Lodge on every point. The ancients were not so trusting, and the negotiators had to report and see discussed, but unable to decide anything. They had to report every point for discussion in an agreement to buy a quarter meeting in the Grand Lodge. It's not surprising that the negotiations dragged on for 3 years. There were powerful forces in the ancient Grand Lodge who did not wish to see a union. Not least amongst them was their Grand Secretary, who delayed everything he possibly could. Even when the game was up and the union achieved, he refused to accept it or hand over the books and papers of the Grand Lodge until paid off with a pension of £100 a year. The Premier Lodge had already gone a fair way to meeting the resolutions put forward by the ancients. They had set up a special lodge of promulgation to bring its ceremonies into line with those of Ireland and Scotland, and thereby the ancients. They had introduced deacons into the lodges, recognised the ceremony for the installation of the master. They had been spending a great deal of time holding special meetings to install those who had been masters of lodges without receiving the secrets of the chair, including the Duke of Sussex and the Earl of Moira. The problematical point would be the composition of the new united Grand Lodge. The Premier Grand Lodge had reserved its membership to Grand Officers, Masters of Lodges, and the Master and others from the Grand Steward's Lodge. The ancient Grand Lodge had been much more democratic, and was composed of the Grand Officers, Master and Wardens of Lodges, and the subscribing past Masters. The difference was to lead to long and at times childish arguments. The Premier Grand Lodge was set against an increase in the membership, arguing at one point that the hall was not large enough to take so many people. Happily, the ancients won through. One of the last steps was the resignation of the Duke of Athol as Grand Master of the ancients, and the appointment of the Duke of Kent as his successor. The Prince of Wales had earlier relinquished his place as Grand Master of Moderns, to be replaced by his brother, the Duke of Sussex. Thus the two royal dukes were in a position to lead their respective Grand Lodges into a union. The Articles of Union had been negotiated and signed, and a ritual developed reconciling those worked by the two Grand Lodges, and they were signed on the 25th of November 1813. A month later, on the 27th of December, a ceremony was held at Freemasons' Hall, forming the United Grand Lodge of England, with His Royal Highness the Duke of Sussex as the Grand Master. It was a memorable and inspiring scene, as the two Grand Lodges, so long estranged, filed into the hall. Delegates of 641 modern and 359 ancient lodges, so mixed as to be indistinguishable the one from the other. Both Grand Masters had seats of honour in the East. The hour was fraternal, each side willing to sacrifice prejudice in behalf of principles held by all in common, and all equally anxious to preserve the ancient landmarks of the craft, a most significant fact being that Athol Masons had insisted that Masonry erase such distinctively Christian colour as crept into it and returned to its first platform. The combined ritual was in turn the emulation ritual, adopted as standard by the United Grand Lodge, although others continued to be used in many lodges. The union largely confirmed the ancients' forms and ceremonies, and therefore considerably revised the moderns' rituals. One of the most important changes was the reference in Article 2 to the Royal Arch degree as included in the third Master Mason's degree, a practice that had always been peculiar to the ancient lodges. Following the union, a lodge of reconciliation was established to complete the rationalization of the ritual into a form acceptable to both parties, forming the new constituted Grand Lodge. And thus, in 1813, the split between the moderns and the ancients had come to an end. The split had lasted for over 50 years, had resulted in a great deal of animosity between the various bodies concerned, but in the end, the union came just at the right time. It is impossible to consider the way in which Masonry in England developed in the course of the 19th century if the moderns and the ancients had continued their rivalry.